And hello again, everyone. Welcome to Mountain States Policy Center's Peak Policy Program. We're here today focused on the election, talking about some of the issues that are on the ballot for all of us here in Idaho, Washington, Montana, Wyoming. We got a lot to get to this afternoon, and we're going to do so throughout the program for the next hour. Talk to you a little bit about some of those issues that you're going to be voting on. Maybe give you a little bit of a preview of the upcoming legislative sessions in our states. And what they might look like after the election, as well as take your questions and hopefully have some answers for you throughout the program this afternoon. So to do that, let's welcome in Jason Mercier. He is the Vice President, Director of our Research Program at Mountain States Policy Center. Jason, good afternoon to you.
Chris, good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Thanks very much for being here. We got a lot to get to today. Before we do, Jason, I want to just make sure everyone knows that if they have a question, they have a comment, they can put it into the chat function today, and we will get to them as best as we can. In fact, I will write right now, here is the chat function. So anyone who wants to put a question or a comment in there, please do so throughout the program, and we will get to that as quickly as we can. Jason, let's start by talking about Idaho's Proposition 1. This is a ballot measure that's getting a lot of attention in the state of Idaho, and I think for some pretty good reason.
Yeah, so I've been reviewing ballot measures for about 25 years, and this is trading one to do an analysis of. That the topic being primarily open primaries, and whether to have an open primary or a partisan closed primary, that's a pretty controversial issue all on its own. But where the complication, the frustration comes in with Proposition 1 is the stated intent is to move Idaho back to the way it used to be with an open primary. If you look at the text and the details of Proposition 1, however, the proponents chose the most complicated and difficult way to accomplish that goal. And if you look at what you have on your screen right now, this is from the official ballot title and summary of Proposition 1, talking about how it's going to get rid of basically the current closed primary, partisan primary, and replace it with a top four multi-party nonpartisan primary. And then it also includes the provision about ranked choice voting. And where I say some of the frustration comes in on this, Idaho right now is one of 9 states that are referred to as a partially closed primary state. That means it's up to the private political parties to decide whether or not they include unaffiliated ballots. The Democrats in Idaho do, the Republicans do not. But again, this is a partisan primary where the parties are determining who their nominees, if you will, be for the general election. Now, what you hear about Proposition 1 is they want to take us back to where it was before Idaho closed their primary a decade ago, to where independents don't have to join the Republican or Democratic Party and they can have their ballot counted. That's called an open primary. This exists in about 15 states across the country, Montana being one of them. You just pick a ballot, you only get one of the party ballots, and you're not restricted. Proposition 1, however, doesn't do either of those things. It's not opening up the traditional partisan primary. And in fact, the Supreme Court last year, when there was a ballot title challenge to Prop 1, like what should the title be, what should the summary be, they actually removed open primary from that because they said this does not propose a traditional open primary as it's been known in Idaho. Instead, it's that top four multi-party, if you will, the jungle primary. And, a multi-party primary exists in a handful of states. You have them in Washington, you have them in California, Nebraska, Louisiana. Alaska is the only one, though, it has a top four. Everybody else is doing the top two or the old comers. So that right there is an indication this is a little bit different than what we've known about across the country. The irony, that top four in Alaska, it's only been in place since the 2022 election, and Alaskan voters may repeal that next Tuesday with another ballot measure to repeal ranked choice voting. So it's a little surprising to see Idaho about to jump into something Alaska may be repealing. So that gets us on the open primary part. The second main component of it, and I think where there's a lot of additional frustration, is when you're doing a top four, if four individuals are moving to the general election, more likely than not, you're not going to get somebody with over 50% support. So the question is, well, who wins? How do you determine that? And that's where the proponents of Prop 1 have included ranked choice voting. Again, only 2 states currently use ranked choice voting: Alaska, which is about to repeal it potentially, and then Maine. So this is not a standard way across the country of determining elections at the general election. Most of them, it's either whoever has the most votes, or if you don't hit that 50% threshold, you'll have a runoff election. This would be a ranked choice voting for Idaho. And I think that that's, again, where you've had a lot of the frustrations about this, because by combining these two different proposals together, and I say different because if you look at the official ballot summary for Prop 1, it says these are two distinct issues. You have the open primary component and the ranked choice voting component. And when you combine those together, voters aren't given a choice. I may want open primaries, but I don't want ranked choice voting. Or I may want closed primaries, but I want ranked choice voting. As a voter now, I don't have a choice because they've combined these together. And that's potentially why you may see litigation after the election, if Prop 1 passes, for something called a single subject violation. You may have heard that there was litigation from the Attorney General pre-election to try to have Prop 1 thrown off the ballot because of this concern about single subject. And the Idaho State Supreme Court rejected that. And I think they did that properly because it was a pre-election challenge. And across the country, pre-election challenges are really disfavored. Courts don't like to tell voters you can't weigh in on something before an election, just like they don't stop legislators from voting on something before it comes to the floor. But the court did not rule on the merits of whether or not this was a single subject violation. So if this passes, you'll probably see litigation around that.
Jason, before we get into the ranked choice voting part, I really want to highlight that piece, because all of the signs that we see around the state, all of the advertisements, all of the things that have to do with this particular issue that say vote yes on Prop 1, they don't mention anything about ranked choice voting. And I think it's perhaps intentional that it doesn't mention anything about ranked choice voting. But as you mentioned, we will likely see this show up in court after the election, if it even passes.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, when you're outside the grocery store and somebody hands you a petition to sign, it's incumbent upon you to read it, to know what you're signing. And that's kind of why I personally never sign these ballot petitions, because as I'm grocery shopping or I'm doing other things, I don't have time to dig into a 15, 20-page document to see what's in it. But there is that responsibility. You should know what you're signing. Same thing with the voting. You really got to understand it, which is why we do these analysis of these ballot measures so voters can really see what's before them. So at the end of the day, whether you're confused or not, it's really up to the voter to take the time to do their homework. But that being said, to your point, all the dialogue around this is about we need to bring Idaho back to how it used to be with open primaries. But that's not what's before us, right? It's not opening up the party primary to allow non-affiliated voters to vote. It's creating a brand new top four multi-party process. Plus, it's adding ranked choice voting for the general election. So a little bit differently than what I think we all were hearing. And I think that just from a policy standpoint, there's a lot of arguments that you can make around open primaries, right? Washington has had what they've called their top two for almost 20 years. That was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, a 7-2 opinion by Justice Clarence Thomas, because when you go to a top two, it's no longer a private party organization, right? You get away from those First Amendment issues. It's just everybody can vote in one ballot and the top two go forward. And then, you can have 2 Republicans, you can have 2 Democrats, or you can have a mix. But by going this direction, the top 4, you've introduced a whole new thing that has only been in place in one state for the past 2 years, and that state's about to potentially repeal it.
Yeah, and Jason, as you know, this really isn't a partisan issue on the ranked choice voting piece. I mean, you see on the screen right there, former Governor Jerry Brown of California has said, in a time when we want to encourage more voter participation, we need to keep voting simple. Ranked choice voting is overly complicated and confusing. I believe it deprives voters of genuinely informed choice. You also, as you mentioned, talked with the secretaries of state of the different states, Montana, Washington. Washington Secretary of State Steve Hobbs, who is a Democrat, says ranked choice voting adds a layer of complexity to voting that threatens to disenfranchise people who are not experts in the process. And there was this kind of a spoof video, Jason, that was going around up in North Idaho of a gal who said, you know what, I like the fact that I'm going to have to learn about 40 different candidates as opposed to 4 candidates the next time I go to vote. And I think that that's something we don't really think about, is the fact that, look, if I'm going to be charged with ranking all these people, I'm going to have to know about these people, or how am I going to know who my second, third, or fourth choice is going to be?
And so as we were doing our research on this, there's a lot of experience with open primaries and multi-party primaries. So that's kind of well known, and you can be for or against that. But with the exception of Alaska, on a statewide level, nobody has been doing ranked choice voting. It's always been at the city level, whether it was San Francisco or New York City. There was actually a county in Washington for one election cycle did ranked choice voting, and they hated it so much, over 70% of voters repealed it the next year. But because the ranked choice voting at the state level was a little newer of a policy, we did interview the Secretary of States in Washington, both the current and the former, the Secretary of State of Montana. We went to the Alaskan election director and asked them about this process. And that's where you see these quotes, and that's where you see both Republican and Democrat supporters of open primaries or closed primaries all basically agreeing that, especially on a statewide level, ranked choice voting adds a layer of confusion and possible delays. And that is actually something that Secretary Phil McGrain wrote to the legislature about. He had a letter back in July talking about what would happen if Prop 1 was enacted. He didn't see any concerns with the open primary provisions, but on the ranked choice voting provisions, he wanted to really flag for them. Idaho does not have centralized elections. It's all done at the county level. That means you're going to have to centralize that. You have to have centralized software for that. And his estimate was somewhere between $25 to $40 million of cost just to be able to count those votes. The other component that he really wanted to warn people about, in Washington state, voters are used to having to wait 2 weeks to know who wins the election because it's all vote by mail. In Idaho, you pretty much know on election night the results. But if you add ranked choice voting on a statewide level, where you're not able to do all that ranking until all those ballots come in and are centralized, you possibly are going to have a delay. And in fact, that's what you saw happen in Alaska. They won't even do that ranking until 15 days after the election, because they have to wait till every single absentee ballot is in before you can do the ranking.
All right, so that is Prop 1. Just a quick reminder to everyone, if you want to read our analysis of all these different measures that we're going to be talking about today, know before you vote. Hopefully, you'll know before you vote. Go to mountainstatespolicy.org. We have all of our ballot guides now available at mountainstatespolicy.org, or just stick with the broadcast today, and we will try to get to as many of your questions and comments as possible. I want to make sure that we address some of these questions or comments that are in here. Tucker's cousin says, it got onto the ballot based upon lies by and omission by signature gatherers. It's not an open primary initiative. Trent says Idaho's Prop 1 is not multi-party. No candidate on the new ballot can be there as a candidate of a party. So if you want to keep adding those questions and comments to the chat, we will read them throughout the program today. Jason, let's look next door at something that's very similar, and that is what's going on in Montana with CI 126 and 127. And before we do, just real quick, for all of our folks who are watching live right now and on a delayed basis, we're going to talk about Montana, we're going to talk about Washington, Wyoming, Oregon, the Bozeman Plastics Initiative, an issue that's coming up in Spokane with Prop 1, and talk about the preview of the upcoming legislative session. So stick with us, keep us on in the background, and we'll get to those today. Jason, let's talk about CI 126 and 127.
And so these two constitutional amendments that were initiated by the voters, so in Montana, you can initiate a constitutional amendment through the voter ballot process. I think that the interesting thing for people in Idaho about these two proposals in Montana is it's a pretty clear indication that you might have a single subject problem with Prop 1, because this is basically the same debate happening in Montana, but with two separate ballot measures. So CI 126 would create a top 4 multi-party primary. Again, we're familiar with that with Prop 1, but it doesn't have anything in CI 126 about runoffs or ranked choice voting. It's just strictly moving Montana from, which is currently an open primary state, they're just moving them to that Alaska top 4 multi-primary. So that's CI 126. CI 127, a separate constitutional amendment, would require somebody in Montana to get over 50% support to win an election. And the reason for this, again, we talked about earlier, if you have 4 individuals moving forward to the general election, it's more likely than not nobody's going to hit that 50% threshold. So what CI 127 will say is you have to get 50%, but it doesn't specify how that is determined. It's up to the legislature to determine, do they want to do a Georgia-style runoff election? Do they want to do ranked choice voting? They get to decide how they determine who hits that 50% threshold. But they're 2 separate proposals, again, because in Montana, their court has routinely struck down ballot measures for single subject violations. I think that's why you saw them separated out, and something to keep in mind going forward for Idaho's Prop 1. If it passes with the 126 and the 127, it'll then be up to the legislature to determine what happens next as far as determining that 50%. I do know as part of our interviewing with Secretary of State in Montana, very strong opponent, just like in Washington, of ranked choice voting. A lot of opposition in Montana to ranked choice voting. So my guess is if these both were to pass, you would see the Montana legislature probably do a Georgia-style runoff.
Questions, comments, put them in the chat function, and we will get to them throughout the program. Again, a reminder, you can go to mountainstatespolicy.org to read any of our analysis on these issues. That is a quick rundown of CI 126 and 127 in the state of Montana. All right, Jason, let's move on to Washington now, and we'll talk about Washington's Initiative 2066. And to do that, let's bring in Madi Clark, who is one of our senior policy analysts at Mountain States Policy Center. Madi, you've done a lot of work on this particular issue and want to make sure the folks know about what Washington's Initiative 2066 is. So take it away.
So Washington's Initiative 2066 is really best summed up as fixing a hot mess. And those are not my words. Washington has worked for years trying to ban natural gas. They have used elected means to do so. They've allowed the bureaucracies to make rules that have added layer upon layer, trying to restrict natural gas bans to the consumer. So this has really hurt. It started a few years ago that they tried to all out just ban it through a building code initiative. Well, they pulled that back and they said, never mind, we're not going to ban it. But they put some mandates for heat pumps into the codes that created credit incentives that were so cost prohibitive. They were essentially a ban. So that's where it kind of stood until the last legislative session. Our sister organization, Washington Policy Center, has worked tirelessly on the State Building Code Council's rules, trying to pull it back. And then it brought us to 2024 in this last session. And the legislature actually tried to make a bill when they first put it forward. Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck called it a hot mess because it was kind of a blank check of what the restrictions on natural gas would eventually apply to. But in front of you, you can see that map of the red states are those that have all out said, absolutely, you cannot create bans at the consumer level for natural gas. So those are really good protections. Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, they've put those in place. A lot of our mountain states have focused on trying to protect the consumer's choice and allow the economics to drive the decision-making. So we move back to Washington, where they're not there yet. And Initiative 2066 is trying to go back and say, we need to protect these decisions. We need to fix this bureaucratic mess that was made by the State Building Code Council. And that is where we're at, is a vote yes on 2066 would prohibit any bans on natural gas. A vote no would allow the mess that's already taking place to continue further. I love what Chris Johnson of the President Association of Washington Businesses said. He said, we are concerned about the State Building Code Council, an unelected body making such a major policy change without direct approval from the legislature. This code adds considerable cost to the use of natural gas, which has major implications for housing costs and business competitiveness in our state. I think he sums it up perfectly there.
Yeah, and Maddie, I think it's important for our friends in Idaho and Montana and Wyoming to realize why we're covering this issue so intently. And that is because what happens in Washington, what happens in California, what happens in some of these more blue states, for lack of a better term, does not stay there. And so if this stands in Washington, don't be surprised if you see attempts to put these type of things in place again in Idaho and Montana, Wyoming, and some of our other states. And I think we also have to recognize, Maddie, that there are some companies, power companies, that provide power to both states or maybe multiple states. And so if a policy in one state is adopted, that makes it more likely that that power company or energy company might try to go to the other state and say, hey, you guys should do this too for the sake of continuity and make it easier for us to do business as well. You know, we had that graphic up on the screen, Maddie, and I think it's worth putting it right back up that shows the state's energy profile. Washington gets 8% of its electricity from natural gas. So I guess my question is, what's the plan here? If they say we're going to ban natural gas, where is this electricity going to come from?
Well, so that's the interesting thing. They're not banning it on a state level. The Washington grid will still have access to this natural gas. It's the consumer. It's the consumer that will suddenly not have the access. Washington has already done a lot to be a green energy consumer. Thanks to our dams and our hydroelectric power, that's 69%. That's huge. So we love the fact that Washington has the green energy because we have those structures already in place. Banning natural gas will only hurt the consumer. It's not going to change where Washington sources it from. It's kind of a lot of virtue signaling from politicians more than anything. This is a great graphic as well, Chris. So on your left, you can see the top 10 lowest cost natural gas states. So this is where natural gas is the cheapest. And then on the right, you see the top 10 highest cost natural gas states. What's so interesting about these numbers is economics, not policy, are always going to drive adoption incentives or adoption of any technology. So the big one they're pushing with natural gas bans is they want everyone to adopt a heat pump, which is a way to heat your home with a higher energy coefficient, which is fantastic. We actually adopted a heat pump here in our home a year and a half ago. It is more efficient, has saved us money. We have an old farmhouse. As you can see, we're working on some replacing windows, trying to increase energy. But we had a diesel furnace. It was horribly inefficient. It was extremely dirty. And so adopting a heat pump made sense. It was a little more out of pocket at the beginning, but very quickly it has paid for itself. So heat pumps are a good tool, but it's not because of the green policy we adopted it. It is cost. So those high energy cost, natural cost states, those are the places you see across the country right here that have actually adopted heat pumps because it costs more to have natural gas, like it costs more for us to power a diesel furnace. And so it made sense to put in a heat pump. Another thing with this chart is a lot of these states are very warm. You lose some of those efficiency coefficients with a heat pump, the colder it gets. So you get to those colder climates and it takes a lot of subsidizing, as in the case of Norway and Finland. They always throw that up of like, well, Norway and Finland have heat pump adoption. That's awesome. They're very, very cold. Well, they were heavily subsidized since the 1970s to encourage those adoptions. If you go to England, they do not have a high heat pump adoption because fossil fuels are cheaper. So it just comes back to that point of costs are going to drive adoptions more efficiently for the consumer, way above policies.
Question or comment, add them to the chat. As I mentioned, we're going to get to a bunch of different conversations today. Maddie, stay with us here because I'm going to bring Jason Mercier back in because, Jason, there are some other issues that Washington voters are going to be voting on or perhaps are already voting on, and we want to go over those as well.
Yeah, you have several ballot measures in Washington. The one that Maddie just talked about, the 2066 on the natural gas ban. You also have one to repeal the state's new capital gains income tax. 2109 repeal the capital gains income tax.
Yeah, we've got an error on the screen there. It should say 20. Is it 2109, Jason?
Yeah, 2109. Okay. It's only taxes. It doesn't matter the exactness on that. And we can come back to that one when we get to a little bit of a conversation about the ballot titles, because there's a story behind that capital gains income tax and where they may be going with these ballot titles. You also have 2117 to repeal the new cap and trade program, which essentially would cut the prices on gas And I've made some jokes that maybe Idaho does not want that one to pass because people keep coming over the border to buy gasoline because it's cheaper. But if that were to pass, then you would lose that. I think it's about 40 cents a gallon that particular regulation is putting on the price of gasoline. And the final one has to do with opting out of the state's new long-term care tax. If you live in Washington and you look at your paycheck, you may not have a traditional income tax, but you're having taxes taken out for paid family leave, and you're having taxes taken out for long-term care. The kicker on that one, though, is you may not ever qualify for the actual benefit, and especially if you leave the state. So that proposal would make it optional whether or not you want to be part of that long-term care tax program.
And Jason, you touched on it, but I want to spend a little more time on it. And that is, again, for our friends in some of the other states who are watching us today, there's somewhat of a controversy going on here with the Washington state measures because it seems that the legislature and some of the statewide elected officials have been able to kind of put their thumbs on the scale here in what, oh, look, I'm getting thumbs up on my screen there. Put their thumbs on the scale here in what the ballot measure actually says on the ballot, and it is somewhat confusing. And it basically says if you're going to vote, it doesn't say exactly this. I'm paraphrasing here. If you're going to vote for this, all hell is going to break loose, and your grandma's going to be thrown off a cliff, and there may be a blizzard. It's just some of the things that it says are just pretty unbelievable, Jason. And there's a reason why this is happening.
Yeah, and it's a very political reason. And so the reason, let's take it back and look at the politics of Washington State. It's been over 40 plus years since there's been a Republican governor in the state. The legislature, more times than not, will hover around a Democratic supermajority. So you routinely will have a trifecta Democratic control of the Washington political process. The ballots measures, however, have consistently been more on the conservative side, where the voters have, if you will, tied the hands of Washington lawmakers on taxes, on regulations, on overreach, on some environmental policies. And from the Democratic lawmakers' perspective, this is frustrating. Their agenda keeps getting disrupted at the ballot box when the voters vote directly on ballot measures. So this is going to be the very first time for a Washington election, that when you go to your ballot, it's not just going to be the summary of the proposal and the ballot title. There's now going to be a little commentary about this, and the commentary was specified by a new bill that just passed that basically will indicate, as you mentioned, all of the potential harms that could occur if this measure were to pass. That's a fine argument to be made in the pro and con statements, not on the official ballot title summary that's directly on your ballot. And this is why I mentioned earlier on the capital gains income tax initiative, because when this passed, it was supposed to be tied to childcare. But there was a lot of litigation around whether or not this tax was constitutional in Washington. And as that litigation was going on, the sponsor of the bill that wanted more childcare said point blank, whether or not we have this tax, we're going to fund this program in the budget because it's a priority for us, and that's a policy decision you make through the budget process. Well, that's what would happen in a normal budget process. If you look at the ballot summary, however, it says if this tax were to be repealed, there'd be no more money for childcare. Now, that's not reality. Budgets are about trade-offs. And for those that have read budgets, there's no such thing as a dedicated account unless it is constitutionally specified. Because the entire back of a budget is all of the raids of dedicated accounts. I think that's the frustration when you add that kind of prejudicial language into your ballot statement, saying if you do this, there'll be no more schools, there'll be no more childcare, and grandma can't get her pills.
Yeah,
legislators can make policy decisions.
Agreed, 100%. And the fact that if there are, I have not seen it. The fact that we have not seen any media or any coverage on this particular issue, the fact that there are such biased statements on the ballot in Washington is really something to behold. I mean, it would be the equivalent of putting a biased statement opposed to Proposition 1 in Idaho on the ballot as well, when you're trying to push voters in one direction or another. And the fact that the state government is doing that and not being held to account is very concerning. Maddie's back with us. Maddie, let's talk a little bit about Oregon Measure 118 And we don't typically cover a lot of stuff from Oregon, but as our viewers will see today, there's a reason why we wanted to highlight this one.
Yeah, well, this one is definitely close to my heart as I'm an Oregonian. I look at Idaho every morning, but I live in Oregon. This Measure 118 is a complete disaster. A few years ago, Oregon took some steps to create the corporate activity tax. I have family members that own small businesses on the west side of Oregon. I should say small. They're a little bit big, but they're not that big. And that corporate activity tax definitely added a lot of burden to their operations because Oregon has this funny concept of thinking that sales mean that you're making a lot of money. So we're moving on from that and we're adding Measure 118, which is funding a universal basic income program. We're going to try and pilot it in the state, and it's a complete disaster. And I think you can see that it's a complete disaster when both sides of the aisle are coming out and saying, this cannot happen in Oregon. This will not work, not only from the economic standpoint, which the conservative movement is really trying to push back and say this will destroy businesses. It will destroy jobs. Absolutely. But then it will take away from the general fund. So there will be no money left to fund any other program. And I shouldn't say any other, but it will take a lot of money out of the general fund because of the way this measure is structured.
Madi, again, we go back to the comment that we were making earlier. These bad ideas don't stay in these states. And so folks who are saying, well, that's just Oregon, Oregon's a bunch of crazies, or that's just Washington. I would say take that with a grain of salt, because you never know when some of these bad ideas are going to seep across the line. And some of our folks may be hanging their hat on the greater Idaho movement. Well, if that doesn't happen anytime soon, you're going to have to potentially deal with universal basic income in Oregon. And as you mentioned, it's not a good situation. Anything more you want to add on that particular one, Madi?
So the way they're going to fund it is this corporate tax it adds will create a 3% tax on sales, not net income. So businesses that might make a lot of sales but have a very small margin are actually going to not be able to function because of the amount of taxes they're going to have to pay on this. So if you sell more than $25 million of product, and I know it sounds like a huge number, but if you just think of your big retailers and wholesalers, if the first one in the line has over $25 million in sales, not profits, sales, that's a 3% added tax to them. They'll pass it on to the next person and the next person and the next person. And suddenly you have a 12% tax on a good in a state where we do not pay a sales tax. That is one thing about Oregon. We don't pay a sales tax. I know it's not great policy, Jason, but we don't pay it. And I don't want a hidden sales tax when I go to purchase things, or even when businesses try and get started, that they have to factor that in of I'm trying to buy goods to get up and running, but it's from a business that's charging me a 6, 9, 12%, depending on how many times that item has moved through a supply chain in Oregon.
Madi Clark is one of our senior policy analysts and the only one on the program today who is not losing her hair. So Madi, thank you very much for being here. Jason, comments about the Universal Basic Income Program.
Well, you mentioned Maddie's hair. If 118 passes, maybe she will look like this.
Exactly.
Well, there's no threat of Idaho or Montana or Wyoming doing a $7 billion a year tax increase, which is a component of Measure 118. But the reason why this is on the ballot there is because there's this universal basic income movement really strong in California, and they're beta testing it in Oregon. They want to get one state to open the door so they can start that domino effect. We opened this program talking about how we've been reviewing ballot measures. I've been doing this for 25 years. I really have to hand it, though, to the sponsors of Measure 118 in Oregon, because I have never seen a tax proposal in any state totally unify everyone in the state against it. The Democratic governor, the Democratic legislature, the Republican legislature, the teacher unions, childcare unions, the chambers, business groups. Everybody in the state is opposed to this because of how bad of a proposal it is. So hopefully Madi will get to keep her hair, because it's looking like it's not going to pass.
Well, there is, I always say there is more that unites us than divides us. So on this particular issue, that is the case. All right, Jason, let's move on to Wyoming's SJR3.
Yeah, I think that this is going to, even though this is a Wyoming proposal, you can trace its roots to the West Coast because as people fled bad policies in Washington and Oregon and California and moved to Idaho and Montana and Wyoming, it kind of had an effect on property values, the cost of housing, and then correspondingly the property taxes. So Wyoming has always been a relatively low property tax state. Most of Wyoming's budget comes from severance taxes for minerals. It's not your traditional property tax or the sales. They don't have an income tax. But for Wyoming, as people have moved in and they've had these assessments, even though it's a small relative burden, it's a big increase for them. So property taxes have been a huge issue. And there have been bill after bill after bill about what to do with them. The only one that made it across the finish line was the Senate Joint Resolution 3, which is a constitutional amendment. When it passed the legislature, it passed overwhelmingly. There was actually no opposition campaign to it. But as we've come closer to the election and people have unpacked it a little bit more, even some of the original supporters now are opposed to it. And the reason for that, it would create basically a fourth class of property in Wyoming. And what that means is when you think about your property tax, this is one thing that Washington actually does very well on taxes. You want property taxes to be uniform and flat so you can't pit property owners against each other and increase tax burdens like cost shifting. So when you do that, you allow spending to kind of grow out of control. And unfortunately, with Senate Joint Resolution 3, by creating that fourth class of property, by separating out residential occupied property from other real property, it does create that situation where a future legislature can start to charge different property taxes for whether or not it's owner occupied or it's a rental home, or have different prices for rental residential property versus commercial property. And you can start to see as you go down the split roll, when you remove that uniformity and you allow government officials to kind of pit taxpayers against each other, it makes it much easier to increase spending. And that's some of the concern now you're seeing about this particular proposal. Property tax relief in the mountain states needs to happen. Right? Idaho did the rebates. Montana's looking at truth in taxation. That's where I think that Wyoming may want to turn their attention to should this measure fail, because then you're getting to the root cause of the property tax increases, the spending, getting more transparency on that and not creating these potential supposed fixes that cause more problems by allowing the cost shift of the tax burden.
Jason Mercier is the Vice President, Director of our Research Program at MSPC. Jason, let's do an overview now. We're going to go down to these local issues, which I've done a lot of research on, but let's start with an overview first of the Bozeman Plastics Initiative and what it would do. We'll also put some information up on the screen.
Yeah, so I don't know how much you want to dive into, Chris, the research that you did comparing this proposal to what we've seen in Washington and other countries, but you often will hear the argument we need to ban plastic bags, plastic containers, plastic straws because there's a high environmental impact. But as your research has indicated, that's actually the opposite case because it requires more energy, it requires more resources to use the alternative things that aren't versus a plastic bag because of the amount of times they're reused. And with the straws, interestingly enough, a lot of the reason why you'll see individuals opposed to these plastic straw bans will come out of the disability community because those paper straws, and I think we've even seen some comments from the Vice President of the United States about this, they don't work very long.
Yeah.
And I actually have a personal story where California is one of these states that have these bans on plastic straws, and had my young daughter at Disneyland, and she turns to me and says, "Dad, my drink doesn't work anymore." "What do you mean your drink doesn't work anymore?" "Well, it was a paper straw. It melted. She couldn't get it to work anymore." Do you want to go a little bit more into some of that research you did on that?
Yeah. So let's talk about what this would do. So the Bozeman Plastics Initiative would ban food containers made of polystyrene foam, packing materials made of polystyrene foam, plastic bags, plastic straws, plastic stirrers, and the fines here, Jason, are pretty significant for a local ballot measure like this if you are found in violation. Now, as you mentioned, Jason, the research on this, the environmental research on this is a pretty mixed in terms of the impact that it would have, but not the least of which is not necessarily whether it's going to have an impact, but what consumers do after plastic bag bans are put in place. Well, the University of Georgia, the School of Forestry and Natural Resources there, took a look at the California plastic bag ban that was put in place and what happened in the days or months after that plastic bag ban was put in place. And voila, the increase of plastic trash bags is very apparent. You see it increase almost 120% in the months after. In other words, people just didn't stop using plastic bags. They just switched the bags they were using to other types of plastic bags, which doesn't do anything. If your contention, Jason, is that you got to help protect the environment here, this shows that that does not actually happen. There's a lot more research in our study, again, at mountainstatespolicy.org about why this is not a good idea, why it is an ineffective environmental policy, what our friend Todd Myers calls an eco-fad. And that's really what it is an eco-fad. And as you mentioned, Jason, we've also seen the disability community come out and be adamantly opposed to these, particularly because many of those plastic straws are used by folks who don't have any other choice. The paper straws fall apart, they don't work, and they get soggy. And it's just not a good situation for a lot of folks who depend on those. Let's also move on, Jason, and talk about Spokane's Proposition 1, which would increase the city sales tax by nearly $8 million per year to fund police, fire, and what they call community resilience. You can fill in your own blank about what that means, but I suppose it could mean just about anything, Jason.
Yeah, and is that community resiliency where this tax proposal starts to go a little bit sideways, because you have seen across the state of Washington, these are what are called the targeted public safety sales tax local options that generally communities will use because they want to hire more police or increase their fire coverage. And when you look at Spokane, an argument can be made. It's a lot of crime, a lot of need to address this, but at the same time, when you look at their budget, there have been increases for these very things, for public safety.
So before we get into the budget, I just want to touch on what you first mentioned here, and that is the need. Okay, we've talked about the fact that, Washington State in particular, Spokane in particular, it's having some crime problems. I mean, you look at the issue on the screen right there. This is the 2022 FBI crime database. Reported cases of violent crime and property crime in the city of Spokane through the roof. I mean, the daily average there of violent crime is 4.2, 36, the daily average in property crime. And as you mentioned, Jason, Spokane's crime statistics are very, very high. So you say, okay, what's the solution for this? Do we need to have more resources? Do we not have enough police? Do we not have enough fire in a city like Spokane? Well, you can decide for yourself. The general fund tax revenues in the city of Spokane continue to go up from $176 million in 2021 up to $194 in 2024. And here's the other data, Jason. The police FTEs and the fire full-time equivalent employees also have increased. So the question becomes, what is the issue, Jason? Is the issue that they don't have enough money, that they don't have enough police and fire, that they need more resources, or that they're not, which is similar to what's going on in other parts of the West Coast, in California, Washington, Oregon, they're simply just not enforcing the law.
Yeah, and that's where I think it's really important, that study that you did there on this proposal, where there's a crime problem. But when you look at the budget, it doesn't seem to be a funding problem. It does seem to be a policy problem. And we were just kind of not beating up on Bozeman, but looking a little bit sideways on how they were doing their bag ban. But their Bozeman City Council is really enforcing and taking advantage of that new U.S. Supreme Court ruling, the Grants Pass case on homelessness, to address that now that they have the flexibility. Spokane has not. So they're not taking advantage of the tools that they have on the policies to address some of these public safety things. And when you go back to the language of this proposal, I'd contrast it with a different public safety sales tax that was on the ballot about 10 years ago in the Tri-Cities. There was a concern about a growing gang problem, and we looked at the data. There was a problem for that. So what this proposal did in the Tri-Cities was targeted exclusively to hiring new officers The money had to go 100% to that. And there were performance audits to show how the money was being used and if it was having an impact on crime. The challenge with the Spokane proposal, with that community resiliency language in this proposal, it may look like it's going to hiring more police, increasing the fire coverage, but that gray area of that language, based upon some of the discussion in the city council, they believe they would have the authority then to use that for climate change activities. What that has to do with public safety is beyond me.
Questions or comments, put them in the chat function and we will get to them throughout the program today. Jason, let's take a short break here. And when we come back, we'll talk about the balance of power in our states and who is likely to be in control when January comes along here on our election preview show on Mountain States Policy Center. Stay with us.
It's the ideas that matter. The Mountain States Policy Manual is a 200-page guide filled with facts, figures, and recommendations on everything from agriculture to education, healthcare, and even transportation. Ideas backed up by years of research, including how to expand on education reform, improving the transparency and accountability of government, lowering healthcare costs and improving patient care, limiting regulations so our small businesses can thrive, and limiting the tax burden we're placing on our families. No other tool will help a lawmaker lead, a journalist write, or an everyday citizen hold their government accountable more than the Mountain States Policy Manual. Because in the end, it's not about the personalities or even the politics, it's about the policies. Visit mountainstatespolicy.org or find the policy manual on Amazon.
And as was mentioned there, you can find the policy manual on Amazon. All you have to do is search for it, or you can read the electronic version on mountainstatespolicy.org as well. It's a great tool if you're on our list. If you've been supporting the work of Mountain States Policy Center, guess what? You're going to get a free copy in the mail here in probably the next week or so. So be watching your mailbox and you will see a copy of it show up. And to all of our legislative friends and our city council friends and county commissioners and elected officials from all over the place, make sure you keep this on your desk during the lawmaking sessions that you have. It really is a terrific resource that you can use. Jason, we've got about 5, 6, 7 minutes here left. So let's talk a little bit about the balance of power in our states. Not necessarily predicting what's going to happen, because I think we both agree that you and I are not real good at predicting what our voters are going to do. But as far as the balance of power in Idaho come January, this is what it is now. What are we likely to see come January? Red dots, of course, representing Republicans, blue dots representing Democrats, the Senate on the left, the House on the left.
Yeah, so for Idaho, these numbers probably won't change a ton. You still will probably have that supermajority control for the Republicans. What will potentially change, and this was the big fight in the primary, is what happens around some of the policies. Because even though those dots may not change, some of the priorities of those members have changed. And that's why you might see a little more conversation around the education choice debate in Idaho advancing a little bit further, because some of those coming into the Capitol next year are probably a little more open to that concept.
All right, Jason, let's go to Washington. Same balance of power there.
Yeah, so for Washington, it's, I said we're not going to make predictions, but it's looking like these large majorities for the Democrats are probably going to be increasing. The question is going to be, does that get all the way to a supermajority? And the reason why that's important, well, there's a lot of reasons why it's important, but right now, without a supermajority, when there are things in the capital budget, with the transportation budget, those require a 2/3, if you will, a 3/5 vote for bonds. If the Democrats have that supermajority, they don't need any Republican votes for those bonds, and that takes away a lot of negotiating power they have in other policies.
And in Montana, red dots, of course, representing Republicans, blue dots, Democrats, and the Senate on the left, House on the right. Supermajorities right now, Jason, but question as to whether that's going to last.
Yeah, it's sounding like, again, the Republicans will have strong control. It's not going to be a toss-up by any means, but indications are, based upon what was coming out of the primary, that supermajority may be reduced a little bit. So you may have a situation where in the legislature, there's a reduction in the supermajority, but Montana may be the one that puts the Senate over the edge for the Republicans at the national level.
Yeah, a lot of important issues on the ballot. Jason Mercier is the vice president, director of our research program at MSPC. Jason, again, the analysis that we've done is all on our website, mountainstatespolicy.org. You can read it all throughout the day today or anytime you'd like. There's a link right on the front page. Jason, thanks very much for being with us.
Good. Thanks, Chris.
And just a couple of quick notes before we take off here. I want to recognize the 4 students who completed our Sawtooth Leadership Academy program. We had a wonderful time with these 4 students. The person on your screen right there is Christopher Sheftick. He wrote a study about growing Idaho's economy by exempting military pensions from taxes. Jonas Yankst wrote a study about providing more education choice options for families. Avery Nichols has a study about whether lawmakers should review the pros and cons of weather modification. And the winner of our Sawtooth graduating class study this year was Joseph Fruhoff, who wrote a study about unlocking economic opportunity with occupational licensing reform. You can read all of the studies that the Sawtooth Leadership Academy did this year on mountainstatespolicy.org, and our 2025 class applications will be open starting on December 1st. A couple of other quick notes. We are in the process of conducting the Idaho poll. We will release that on December 12th at the Grove Hotel in Boise for our legislative luncheon. Make sure you get your tickets at mountainstatespolicy.org. And don't forget about our spring dinner coming up at the Coeur d'Alene Resort on Friday, April 11th with Judge Janine Pirro. You can get tickets right now online, mountainstatespolicy.org, mountainstatespolicy.org, Friday, April 11th for our 2025 spring dinner with Judge Janine. And she is terrific. And I can tell you that there are a lot of seats going really, really quickly for that event. So if you want a ticket, go on right now to mountainstatespolicy.org. For our staff and board at Mountain States Policy Center, thanks very much for being with us, and we will see you again next time here on Peak Policy.
Thanks for watching Mountain States Policy Center. To stay up to date on the work of MSPC, visit mountainstatespolicy.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Mountain States Policy Center. Free markets first.